Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology. I love astrology. It's one of the most fascinating metaphysical science and art forms out there in existence. And I got a great guest coming on in a few minutes. Before we get to that, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, I'll do a couple paragraphs of mundane astrology, and then I'll break it out into the individual signs. I encourage you to look at that. Also, all links to my podcasts are there, my television shows, and all the archives of what I've done are there as well. So it's a great resource for anybody who wants to do that. My website is turningofthewheel.com, chrisflisher.com, and turningofthewheel.tv are all sites that you can find me at if you choose to. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and all those places as well. So I was at the United Astrology Conference in Chicago a few weeks ago, and I happened to stumble upon this really interesting subject, I thought, which is called the Astrology Code. And it's statistical evidence of universal design, and it's written by Michael Bergen, and he's going to be joining me today to discuss what this sort of empirical look at astrology reveals for us. So welcome to the show, Michael. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So listen, tell me about this. What inspired you to sort of undertake this? It's always been a curious thing for me, and I've always wondered how we could validate this more precisely, and you seem like you've done just that.
Well, I did my best to do that, at least.
Yeah. A lot of research, it looks like. A lot of work.
Yeah, well, when I was about 18 to 20 years old, I had a vision for myself that I would someday discover something, some great truth that would really help the world to get to its next stage of humanitarianism, spirituality. I was raised as an atheist, and I didn't have any real concept of these things, but somehow inside of me, I was given this idea. And when I discovered astrology a few years later, I just knew that this was going to be the topic that I was going to discover something great and try and help show the world a new way of seeing themselves.
Mm-hmm. But there's a mathematical component to it, which is really intriguing, I think, because that's sort of what drove you to it. It's sort of the statistical, empirical collection of data, which allows you to come up with certain conclusions, right?
Mm-hmm, sure. Well, at this time, I really had no idea what I was going to discover. And I studied pretty much every field of astrology that I could find resources to learn about. And I started testing all of these different techniques myself with my small database of about 100 people. And what I started realizing is that not every technique that I was learning was working exactly the way I was instructed that it would work. So I went through a period of disillusionment, actually. And that's what led me into my whole spiritual journey. So I withdrew from the astrological studies and entered into a period of meditation and learning, and I was just devouring every book of wisdom that I could to try and understand what the fundamental nature of our reality is. Mm-hmm. So after doing this for a while, I started having new ideas about astrology. Since I also studied Vedic astrology, I was learning about harmonic charts. And one day I was trying to figure out what was causing, what transits or progressions were instigating or reflecting, symbolizing a period in my life where I had gotten engaged to my wife and then moved in with my wife. But there was absolutely no standard Western technique that was indicating anything, which shouldn't really happen. If you're an astrologer, you should be able to see some something so significant in a person's life. So what I did was I actually looked at my ninth harmonic chart, but not in the sidereal zodiac. I did it in the tropical zodiac. And what I found is that Pluto was exactly on my on the moon in my ninth harmonic chart to the minute at the exact time that I moved into with my wife and then married my wife. And this, to me, was a strong signal that there was something to be found here. So I went about testing, once again, all of the different planetary ninth harmonic positions using my database. And I started seeing, first of all, that Mercury was a very strong indicator, as well as the moon and sun. And then I started looking at the aspects between planets in the ninth harmonic chart. And I just became utterly convinced that the ninth harmonic chart was an extremely effective technique to be used. At this time, I had no idea about doing any sort of statistical research about this, but I knew that I wanted to use this technique to eventually become a professional astrologer. The question that I had for myself is how best to get this information out to the public. Should I be doing this one person at a time via counseling, consulting? Or is there a better means to get this information out to people? So since I have a mathematical background, it occurred to me possibly I could do a statistical project. Mm-hmm. But I had no access to a database or software that could analyze a database of information. Fortunately for me, I found Lois Rodden's database, which contains 20 to 30,000 people's fully biographied birth times and exactly where the sources of their birth times were and the major life events that occurred with each person. And there was actually a piece of software called the Astro Data Bank.
AstroDinst, right, yeah.
Right. Which allowed me to actually select a particular attribute of a person. Say, was this person a doctor? Did this person have 4 or more children? Did this person live past the age of 80? So I was able to actually create 80 to 100 different study groups based on these events that occurred in each person's life. And the size of the groups ranged from 80 all the way to 1,500. So some of the groups are actually very large. And so what I went about doing is, first of all, downloading all of these different groups and cleaning them up to make sure that people belonged in the groups that they were a part of. And then I went about using Jigsaw, which is a program that you can use with SolarFire,
right.
to test every technique that the program would allow me within each study group. And I ended up finding that many techniques, especially within the ninth harmonic, were extremely predictive. Like it really worked the way you would think an astrology technique would work. And so what I did is I published all of this ninth harmonic research on the internet, but it was just a bunch of tables, so nobody really knew what to do with that. So after a while, I thought to myself, well, why don't I just go ahead and test everything and then publish that? Because this will be a much more useful study to everybody, since almost nobody in Western astrology uses the ninth harmonic, but we do all use the regular natal chart. We do use planets on the axes, the ascendant and the midheaven. We do use aspects. And so I went about testing all these different Western techniques, and I found that some worked really well. And as I had discovered when I first started learning astrology, some really didn't work at all. And so I was really not sure why certain techniques worked and didn't work. But this research led me to a whole philosophical investigation of the roots of each method. Why did people decide to use a method in a certain way? Does this make sense or does it not? And it's actually taken me many years during the research and after the research to come to a somewhat of an understanding of the whole astrological world. There's so many different techniques and different philosophies, and everybody fully believes in what they're doing. And for somebody to just say, "Oh no, this doesn't work," it wouldn't be appropriate unless you actually had an actual methodological basis for saying such a thing.
So you made very good sense. I mean, this makes a great deal of sense. Thanks for explaining that so carefully and precisely. It one of the things that's most frustrating about astrology, and I'm in the same boat as you. I've always been a skeptic, which I think keeps me always wondering, always pushing the envelope, always trying to find the truth there. But there is so many variables. Each claims to be accurate. Each claims to be more precise than the other, and that runs a wide array of outcomes and precisions, and that are either accurate or not accurate. And it's very frustrating, I think, to find that oftentimes. What I notice a lot of times as well is that especially in the world of, say, social media, you'll see people posting charts and they'll start rattling off the aspects that they think caused the problem. And yet that whatever caused that problem or event to happen, never, when those same things reoccur, not always, the same thing doesn't always happen again. So there isn't really this sort of cyclical predictability that we want to see, especially from the eye of a mathematician, such as yourself. You want to see reproducible incidences that are going to point to a significant marker, and those just aren't there. Someone could be in a car accident or pass away or whatever, and we go looking at their charts, looking backwards at their charts to try to find where the event is or what the combination of aspects was that created that problem, and it is not reproducible. So you found that with your work with the ninth harmonic, you got much more accuracy with the commonality of events and planets in their aspect to the event that it did manifested. And that is remarkable in itself, because the only way you could really do that would be through a statistical analysis. And I imagine that as time goes on, we have more empirical data from which to draw. This truth will become even more evident.
Right. The whole purpose of this project I embarked on wasn't so that I myself would come up with all the final answers. It was just in hope that I would provide enough information that would instigate other people to create even larger research projects in ways that I have no access to right now, because there are the amount of subjects that can be studied astrologically through statistics is really almost innumerable. If there's a phenomena, then it can be researched, and my perspective is that astrology eventually will become a scientific field that will be studied just like any other scientific field. Every science has always started in the dark, and a few people would learn certain things through their understanding and research, and it would eventually catch on, and people would realize that there's real purpose and value in this field, and eventually it would become an established science. So in my opinion, it is inevitable that astrology will become one of the natural sciences somewhere down the road, and I really would love to make that happen.
Yeah.
One reason is because it is so useful to people in regular life, but the other thing that's so very important about astrology, which makes it unique among sciences, is that it really does indicate to us that the universe is following an organic design pattern, that life is not just a random accident. There's really no way that astrology could happen if there wasn't some mental conscious process within the universe that would cause the planets to symbolize personal traits of ours. I don't believe that the planets are a causative factor. I think all of the universe is actually a symbol, a visual, auditory, vibrational symbol of ourselves. And that's why a birth chart will symbolize each person. Because, in fact, the universe is a mental symbol of each one of us. And that moment that we are born, that is a symbol of you.
Right. And so the idea that it's not so much that a single planet is going to be causing something, it's more the construction and the interplay of all of these pieces together that create a theme. But since time is always moving forward, and it's like a corkscrew, I think. And so that we have this cyclical time moving forward where events recur, and then but they recur in a different place in time, so that the obviously the context will be different for what happens to that person, which of course can then shade the outcome. So a person could have an aspect similar to another person, but they're in a different place in time. They may have a similar type of event that unfolds to them, but it could be 40, 50 years apart. But the theme of it would be the same. In other words, you're still in a certain area of life where that would recur. We see that with the Saturn returns, Jupiter returns, all the major planetary returns. We see those things unfolding and coming around in that time. And so, in theory, because time is always evolving, time is always moving, we're never going to really truly ever have a reproductive time, a reproduced time that has happened before. We will see similar mathematical constructs based on the geometry of the planets that recur and perhaps herald up a certain type of theme. But we won't see the same thing because time is always moving forward. We can't go backwards.
We are always moving forward. We can't go backwards. Right. Time is actually the motion of ourselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting in that regard but you do see you are able to come to some sort of correlation based on significant planets, probably more the inner planets perhaps than the outers because of their proximity and the interaction of them. And we do see this through history. What always concerned me was that there was no sort of common agreed upon formula, rationale for, if X happens, Y will be the outcome, so to speak, or X plus Y equals Z. Those kinds of events we weren't able to produce that, and that's what I think your work is aiming to do, is trying to establish the logic and the consistency of those events happening and events.
Yeah, which is why I think that it's so important for astrologers to also have a spiritual path, because for me the causative factor is always within ourselves, and the planet involved in a particular event in your life will symbolize what's actually happening inside of you, which will then typically manifest as some sort of event in your outer life. And through the astrological pattern, we can see amazingly what's happening both inside of yourself as well as outside of yourself. Right. So it's very educational to a person. In ancient, older astrology systems, the perspective was mostly about the outer life. Am I going to do well financially? Will I have children? Will I be healthy? But as our thinking evolves, we want to know more and more about who we are. And this is what New Western astrology is attempting to do.
And it seems to be doing a pretty good job. I mean, you certainly can get very strong characteristics about a person. You can get to know someone very well from seeing their astrology chart. I think as an overall sort of, painting an owner's manual for a person, so to speak, for lack of a better term, when you draw up a composite natal chart and you begin to see who the person is, we sort of have, this is the operating instructions for Chris or Michael. That's sort of the idea. But when it comes to the idea of events happening to people, that's where things become a little bit wonky, because we try to find what's the trigger that sets that off? What brought this down? And it's not the same. Did the same thing that when the World Trade Center was attacked on 9/11, was that similar to, you'd think that would be similar to a event along the lines of a Hiroshima, because there would be similar characteristics, because they're big world events that cause, man-made events that cause human death and destruction. And yet, do we see those common threads all through history, especially on events that would share that kind of stage?
Well, what I would refer to isn't so much what's happening in the macro collective reality. I like to use astrology to study the individual. And when I do find, say, a person has a Saturn-Moon conjunction, inevitably this person is going to be dealing with some issues of depression or seriousness in their emotions, inability to express themselves freely. That could manifest in a number of ways. They could have had very authoritarian parents. They might have gone to a school where they were had a lot of rules imposed upon them.
Restrictions all around.
It's a general theme, but it could manifest in many different ways. And for a person to see a Saturn-Moon conjunction in their first or in their ninth harmonic chart, then they would inevitably have to own that some part of them is being repressed and held down by themselves, in fact, because each of us holds the key to unleash ourselves, to realize our potential and who we want to be. So then you could go about trying to find particular types of studies, workshops, therapies that could help you the most in dealing with that issue.
Yeah, and a lot of it, I think, also depends upon, there's an element of free will we've got to bring into the story. There's also an element of environment and circumstances that come into because a person who's living in a horrendous situation somewhere else may have a similar set of aspects as you or I have, and yet they manifest that as those aspects much differently due to their context and place in life, and all of those things as well.
Yeah.
And that makes a big difference with regard to how those are going to manifest. A person, as you mentioned, with a Moon conjunct Saturn could have a serious side to them, could be a very sober kind of individual, reserved, constrained, but they could also use that in some way to sort of be, I could see someone like that being very responsible when it comes to childcare or being a good counselor because they have a serious outlook on life and they're able to manifest their emotions in a way that's responsible and empathetic, perhaps. But so you get those blending of characteristics and types, and you begin to develop people. And then when you run these statistics and you see people who have this type of occupation or this type of, they go this way, you must be able to find that in a series of reproducible markers. So when you're looking at, say, from the back of your flyer, you have artists or astrologers typically have Venus in Cancer. And that means that there's a lot of astrologers who have that particular characteristic. Not all astrologers have that, but an overwhelming majority of them do. So that points to a person who would have a good quality for that, right?
Yeah, well, a Venus in Cancer would indicate to me that the person has a strong empathy.
Right.
They're able to connect and relate to other people in a nurturing way that actually comforts and understands another person's emotions and is able to create intimacy with a person in a short amount of time.
Right.
Which is a tremendous skill to have as a counselor.
Oh, it certainly is, because you think of most people when they go to a traditional therapist will spend a year or two in there, an hour every week, whereas an astrologer can get to some of those situations very quickly and with great precision as well. But there are other characteristics that would also point to astrologers. For example, a Moon conjunct Uranus in the 10th house, excuse me, might do very well for that as well.
True. I did see that the Sun with Uranus was a strong factor in the astrologer study group.
Yeah. Because it has that sense of, there's the unusual quality, there's the inventive and the curious quality of it that's there, that's very real, which we all recognize as astrologers. They have the ability to parse through unusual situations, unusual information.
Yeah, and also the open-mindedness to the new.
Right.
And also the receptiveness to their intuition.
Yeah, and the Aquarian quality of that, I think, as well is there, because it does allow us to look at, especially with regard to mundane astrology, it's sort of the global worldview. So we see that. It's interesting, though, that when you see these, and so when you come up with these parallels between occupation and planetary placements, your basis for making what's your line that you draw for saying that this is a common thread for someone with this occupation? How much data?
Well, there's such a thing as a bell curve,
right?
And if you imagine the top of a bell curve, and you draw a line straight down to the bottom, that would represent a typical average amount of, say, Moon in Cancer for a particular group. So at the very tail end of the bell curves, typically statisticians will use the 5% ends of the bell curve. And so that's what I did. But quite often, my findings would go well off into the upper regions of the bell curve, well over. The say the upper 5% region of a bell curve would indicate that the chances of something happening by accident in that study are 1 in 20. So a statistician will say if the odds of something occurring are 1 in 20, then that's relevant to me. So I actually went much further and found that many findings were over 1 in 1,000. So when you get a lot of findings like this, and the findings are exactly the way astrologers would have defined these findings, then you know something's happening. If you were to do a random statistical analysis, you might get many findings that are in these regions, but the symbolism might not mean anything. There were certain instances where the symbolism wasn't what I expected, such as with Libra and Aquarius. And that confused me greatly at first, but then it led me on this whole investigation of what possibly could be happening, because groups such as people who are married for 15 years or more, and another group where people who had more than 4 children, were very common with planets like Venus being on the midheaven or ascendant and Venus aspects, but also strong in the sign Aquarius. Now, Venus is not commonly associated with Aquarius. It is associated with the sign Libra as well as Taurus. But I was finding actually that Venus qualities such as being charismatic, being very relationship oriented, being faithful and committed in relationships, were actually much stronger with people with planets in Aquarius as opposed to Libra. So what I actually learned is that the Greek mythology for these signs actually confirmed what I was seeing. That is that Aquarius, the water bearer, was actually a beautiful boy that Zeus fell in love with and kidnapped to be his water pourer in his home so that he could have this person near him. So this was not a rebellious, intellectual, opinionated, justice-seeking person. This was a very relational, attractive person that is more interested in bringing people together, as opposed to standing up for something in spite of your relationships. That actually was what I found for Libra, because the category of activists was very strong with Libra. And what Libra, the scales actually represents, is not exactly balance. It's actually the scales of judgment. So Virgo represented some kind of ending or wounding. And for this reason, a lot of the study groups of ailments such as heart attacks and cancer and AIDS patients were strong in Virgo. And the very next sign after Virgo is when you make a judgment about some sort of injustice or injury. And in order to make a judgment, you have to have a very strong intellect. And you have to be very independent and stand up for your own beliefs. And so this is what Libra is really about. It's the opposite sign from Aries. These are cardinal signs. This is the axis of independence. Aries represents personal pioneering, but not necessarily imposing that on other people around you. It's a much more independent energy, whereas Libra is about being independent but affecting other people directly through your independent thinking. And so I realized that by writing about this and observing this new understanding of Libra and Aquarius, that it would be very difficult for the current astrologers to accept it first. But for me as a researcher, I using a Libra type energy, I felt I needed to express what I found, and even if it was difficult, because and I'm not saying that I'm necessarily right about everything I say, but this is my very best attempt to understand what's happening, and I hope to instigate others to do the same and investigate and research. And maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but the process of researching is what will get astrology to its next level.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the sort of the missing link. And I think this would not have been possible had we not had computers, because the amount of time spent to do the research would be, exhausting. It would probably take a lifetime. But now we are able to accelerate that process through the use of computers and databases and statistical analysis to sort of draw these correlations, which I think are very real. We're talking today with Michael Bergen. He's the author of The Astrology Code, Statistical Evidence for Universal Design. His website is astrologycode.org, O-R-G. I encourage you to go check out that spot and see what he's got. He's got his book up there for sale as a PDF. A very valuable idea to do that. And we'll be back in about 2 minutes after a brief break here. But astrologycode.org is his website, and his name is Michael Bergen. We'll be right back in about 2 minutes.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today. Or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
Hi, your host, Chris Flisher here. I've been producer and host of this podcast and radio show for the past 10 years. My goal has always been to provide enlightening, progressive, and logical discussions about where we are as a species and how we move ourselves further down the road towards our greater potential. I believe astrology provides a great tool for observing our progress and awakening our consciousness to becoming a whole, better, and more complete individuals. I have sought to invite the best contemporary guests, thought leaders, and progressive minds to discuss topics that concern us all, regardless of your beliefs. Consider making a contribution through PayPal to help keep the great wheel turning so that I can continue for the next 10 years along the same enlightened path. As always, I thank you for your support.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Michael Bergen. He is the author of The Astrology Code, Statistical Evidence of Universal Design. And it is a sort of a mathematician's, statistician's role or view of looking at astrology, trying to draw correlations between planetary alignments and occupations, character, personality traits, and character. And these are things that have always plagued me because I've been frustrated by not being able to understand that completely sometimes. And it always frustrated me because I'd see charts happening and people would say, well, this happened because Mars was on his ascendant and squaring his moon. And yet when that happened again in another 2.5 years, nothing happened. So you'd want to find, in order for astrology to work, it's got to be reproducible like any science. You've got to have empirical data. You've got to prove it to be work. You've got to test it through scientific method, which is what you're doing. Now, that may not have been done as a rule, and a lot of what we took to be sort of just the rules of astrology, sort of the old cookbooks that we go through, rules of astrology. And that does work with regard to broad themes, I think. But when you come down to events and precision and stuff like that, then you're getting a little more granular with the aspect of timing. So when you're talking like on the back of your list here, you have things such as events, inheritance, heart attack, for example, a propensity for alcoholism or even for culinary delights. And so some of these things are character traits like depression would be a character trait. An alcoholic would be a character trait. An astrologer would be a character trait. But a heart attack is not a character trait. That is an event. And you have that attributed to Aries in this case. Does this imply that Aries are more prone to heart attack? And if so, what would be the trigger for that? What are the sort of I understand the logic behind Mars and being that active sort of charging kind of, unbound anger or bound up anger being held within an Aries. But so that I can see that on an intellectual level. But how do you come to that conclusion with regard to an event?
Well, first of all, I studied two groups based on how long they lived. One was the group of people that lived past the age of 80, and another group was people who did not make it to the age of 30. And what I found with the group that did not make it to the age of 30 is that Mars was very strong in their charts. And for the group of people that lived past the age of 80, Mars was very weak in their charts. It did not show many aspects or positions near the midheaven or ascendant. And so for me right there, I could see clearly that the idea that Mar actually means to harm is actually effective. And with Aries has an energy similar to Mars, which is that it's willing to leap before it looks. And as a result, you can get yourself into many difficult situations. In terms of heart attacks, this Mars and Aries energy will greatly increase your level of energy, but also your level of stress. Mm-hmm. Because you're willing to do things that may conflict with those around you, or it may just be physically risky things like skydiving.
Yeah, risk taking. Aries are known as risk takers, and
right.
That would definitely open the door for more possibilities for such a thing to happen.
True.
And there's a sense of tension. Mark Edmund Jones, maybe you've heard of him. He's a famous astrologer. He always talked about the first placement he looked at in a chart was where Mars was, because he thought that was where, he said, if you know where Mars is in a chart, you'll understand the motivation of the individual. And he would use a standard whole house signs, and if you got Mars in your third house, you're a writer, or you're going to be someone who communicates. If you got Mars in your fourth house, you may be very motivated towards, domesticity items and stuff like that. So as a character trait, he would refer to that. So it's interesting that you brought that up. And it does make sense in that case, but that doesn't mean that a Pisces can't have a heart attack, or a Virgo can't have a heart attack, or anybody else. Of
course.
Yeah. It just means
in every study group, you will have a distribution of the planets through all of the signs. Mm-hmm. The difference is that you may have the sun twice as frequently in the sign of Aries as opposed to the other signs. So, of course, anybody could have their sun in Pisces and have a heart attack. Anybody could have Mercury, Venus, Mars in Pisces and have a heart attack. What I'm finding are themes for each group. It's not predictive. It's indicative.
I see. Yeah, that's a big thing. So the predictive thing is what most of us try to look at. Now, when we talk about mundane astrology, it becomes much easier in some ways because we don't need the specifics that we have to do with when it comes to the personal individual. When we talk about mundane astrology, we can see these large, sweeping sort of cultural and social and trends happening over time that really hold up well with astrology. In so many ways, mundane astrology works quite well. Uranus stepped into Taurus, so we have volcanoes. Well, that's a perfect representation of Uranus and Taurus, because it's the Earth exploding. And so all of those things make sense. So we see these things on the world stage. But when it comes to the individual, every one of us is born at a different place in time. And it does make sense from placement of birth, because you do see national traits. Like if you're from Germany, you may have a certain kind of character based on the place that you're born in that area. And that's why you get societies and languages would evolve, because people are living within proximity of each other and they're born, and so they develop this sort of cultural theme that holds them all together. But when it comes to the individual, and we just roll that dice, and our birthday comes up, and we have a precise birth time, and we roll out that chart, it's phenomenal how accurate it is. And yet, when it comes to the events that you have, is where we find these problems. But your study is based more on sort of personality or character types, is what you found more so than events, right? I mean, you didn't do any work on the occurrence of events with the similar themes, did you, or similar aspects, right?
Well, one macro study I did was with the two outer planet conjunctions. Let me just look at my book here. So there were two major conjunctions in the last 150 years or so. The first one was a Neptune-Pluto conjunction in Gemini, sorry. And this happened in the years 1891 and 1892. And very interestingly, I found that almost every group that was strong with this particular conjunction were highly intellectual people, which symbolizes Gemini very well. For instance, we had activists, astrologers, musical composers, fiction writers, mathematicians and physicists, mystics, poets, professors, spiritual teachers, technical people, writers. I'm not cherry picking here. The only two groups that were strong with this conjunction that didn't fit were military and people who lived past 80 years. So this is actually, I just ran off the entire list. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And the other conjunction that occurred was between Uranus and Pluto in Virgo. This happened in 1965 and 1966. Now, I was saying before how Virgo is often a sign which indicates medical ailments and injuries. And lo and behold, I'll read off the entire list. Almost every group that was strong with this conjunction fits that category. People who are born with birth defects, drug abusers, people who lived 29 years or less, the mentally handicapped, mental illness, sex offenders, people who are adopted, fighters. The only three groups that didn't quite fit that were people who had the same job for 10 years, people who were models, for clothing models, and people who are athletes. But athletes could even fit into that as well, because they commonly get injured in their sporting activities. So I did actually find that the astrology of the macro, what we call mundane astrology, is very relevant.
Mm-hmm. It does make sense, especially when you look at that this first time you mentioned, which was the Neptune-Pluto conjunction in Gemini. That was a birth time, when you look from the mundane perspective, of a wide range of theological and philosophical movements that came about at that time. The Theosophical Society was around then, and there was a range of sort of the Impressionists, not the Impressionists, but there's a lot of the composers at the time were dealing in that same sort of vein. There's a real connection there between, especially across the arts and the sort of the personal expressions that you see of that time. And then, of course, as we know, like 65, 66 was an explosion of the arts in all forms, really revolutionary in that regard. We certainly took a turn in the road there that we've not gone back to, and it's led the way for much of where we are today. Those kind of events are very prominent there.
Yeah.
It's really amazing when you see that. When you look at this as a body of work and you stop and you say, does this provide you with the ability to, does it help your predictive skills because you see a certain theme recurring, or is this more of a traditional sort of astrology, sort of weather forecast that we all sort of live with as we're talking about astrology?
Well, it's definitely helped me tremendously with my predictive skill using charts because, first of all, I use the ninth harmonic chart to also assess how transiting planets as well as secondary progressed planets are influencing us. You see, when a planet is conjuncting a position in your ninth harmonic birth chart, it'll take a tremendous effect. See, this is how I discovered the ninth harmonic in the first place, is that Pluto was on my moon, which represents the feminine and my home, right when I got engaged to and then married my wife. So another example, O.J. Simpson in his natal chart has a lot of planets in Cancer and Aquarius. Now, these two signs are very gregarious, likable energies. And in fact, he did have a very charismatic, likable personality. The first harmonic natal chart represents your outer life, how people see you. The ninth harmonic, which represents the solar aspect of you, who you are in the world. The ninth harmonic represents the inner you, and it's symbolized by the moon, the lunar energy. The way to actually mathematically connect the moon to the ninth harmonic is simply by dividing the 360-degree zodiac by the 27 days it takes the moon to travel the zodiac. When you divide 360 by the 27 days, you get 13 degrees and 20 minutes. This is what in Indian astrology or Vedic astrology they call a nakshatra. Mm-hmm. And that's 13 degrees and 20 minutes exactly. And each 1/9 portion of a sign is 3 degrees and 20 minutes. So there are exactly 4 of these in the daily motion of the moon. And just as there are 4 phases of the sun's cycle each day, morning, afternoon, evening, and sleep time, you have the lunar daily motion divided into 4 1/9 portions of the zodiac. So there's an actual lunar connection to the ninth harmonic. And from this I can have a stronger validation for the idea that the ninth harmonic represents what we experience on the inside. What people see from the outside very often is not what you are experiencing on the inside. Any therapist will have a great deal of evidence of this. Somebody might seem incredibly successful to the world, but then turn around and commit suicide the next week. You can't really know what's going on. But with the ninth harmonic, this gives us an eagle-eye view right into the inner world of a person. So going back to using predictive astrology, you can see when a planet is conjuncting by transit a ninth harmonic position in your chart, and you can see what's happening inside of a person, as opposed to assessing using the regular natal chart what's happening outside of a person in their outer lives, which is typically what astrology was always used for. So I see the use of the ninth harmonic as very much assisting the goals of Western astrology.
It's much more precise. It's more precise.
And it tells us about our inner selves, mm-hmm. which is very important to the Western mind. So I will calculate a solar return chart based on when the sun returns to the exact position of the position when you were born, and I'll also calculate the ninth harmonic chart with the natal chart, so I can see what that person's year may look like from an outer perspective as well as the inner perspective. Mm-hmm. As I said, with transits, I'll look at both the first harmonic and ninth harmonic chart. And with secondary progressions, I will use aspects which relate to the ninth harmonic, which are 40-degree aspects. Many astrologers think of these as very minor aspects, but in truth, if 2 planets are exactly 40 degrees apart in the zodiac, they are conjunct in the ninth harmonic. And so when you use secondary progressed transits, well, they're not transits, but relationships, then you will see strong symbolic connections between what that symbol might represent and what's happening in your life. I also actually use every 10-degree relationships as well to see more minor occurrences in your life. So the ninth harmonic has many applications for predictive astrology as well.
And is it always the same position of the same planets that cause the same sort of outcome?
Well, as we were saying before, each planet represents a spectrum of energy.
Right.
For instance, Mars could represent harm or injury, but it could also represent, which it quite often does in my life, starting a new project, pushing myself forward in life, having courage to do something that I might not have had courage to do before. So, as you said earlier, it really just depends on where you are as a person, what's going on in your life at the time, what's happening in the world around you. We're not isolated in bubbles. We're all interconnected.
Yeah, I see that. When you refer to your own sort of epiphany with regard to this, and you got married and you found that the moon was on conjunct your Pluto in your ninth harmonic chart, what would have been like, and how does Pluto represent for you that? Does that seem like more of a fated karmic sort of position for you, or supposing it was moon conjunct Jupiter? What kind of outcome would you get there if it was the same sort of thing on your wedding day or when you met your wife?
Well, first of all, Jupiter as a transit, I wouldn't consider to be a highly powerful influence. Sure, it could co-symbolize. Like if I see Pluto on a position like the moon, and then I also see Jupiter on your sun at the same time, then that Jupiter on your sun would indicate to me that your experience is likely to be expansive. It's likely to be consciousness expanding. It's likely to be positive and joyful. Whereas if I saw Saturn on your sun while Pluto was on your moon, I would think pretty much the complete opposite thing. It's a time to get serious. It might be a time of unhappiness, or it could be a time of taking responsibility.
Right. It could be a time. It could be very. I mean, it could be a real life-changing moment where you're forced to step up. I mean, getting married is a responsibility. You're now sort of in a partnership with another person, so that could be equally positive. So. I'm wondering how your impression would have been had you found that ninth harmonic chart and you saw moon on Saturn or moon on Uranus or moon on another planet or Neptune. If you saw it on Neptune, would you have been, misled perhaps or not seeing the world clearly if the moon was on your Neptune at that point in time?
Sure. Then in that case, Neptune on my moon would indicate that I'm probably not seeing the situation clearly. And it's probably not going to end up the way I was thinking that it would. However, if that were the case, then I wouldn't have thought to myself, wow, this is a perfect fit. You see, I'm not trying to force the planetary symbols to represent things they don't. If the symbols are not representing what we're taught they represent, then they're not working.
Right.
Then perhaps we need to reconsider what those symbols mean. Or perhaps the technique isn't actually working at all. If we're doing too much funny business with trying to make things fit the person or the event, then we have to reconsider what we're doing.
I agree. That was the point I was trying to make when I was saying about backing into astrology. So we see this a lot. You must see it on social media yourself. Something happens, somebody dies or whatever, and all of a sudden people rush to find out the answer in the chart, and so you wonder if that is. And it never is the same, which always frustrates me. There's never a sort of a common formula signature that says, yes, this is why this happened. When you think about, like you mentioned earlier, being able to see some of these things, do you think you could have predicted or seen the possibility of suicide in somebody who appeared to be famous and appeared to be happy?
No. Well, first of all, I would never want to predict anything like that.
No, right.
Yeah, and I would never, especially if I were consulting with somebody, say anything like that.
I don't mean that. No, but did you see that? Did you see that linkage there? And does it ring a bell when you say you look at? Let's just look at this from the term of our recent events. We have both Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain both committed suicide within a week or so of each other, and they both are very successful people.
Right.
Which outwardly gives us the sense that these people have got the world is their oyster, and yet inside they're exactly the opposite, incredibly unhappy. Did you see any correlation in there too?
I actually did not look at their chart,
Okay.
but if I were to take a guess at what I might see, then it would be some sort of Neptune or Pluto. Neptune representing disillusionment and loss, Pluto representing transformation of some kind. But I wouldn't just go immediately in my mind to a specific prediction.
Right.
I would just see, they have a Neptunian energy or a Plutonian. I wouldn't go trying to imagine.
They'd be more prone. They'd be more prone. Someone with a strong Neptune influence would be more prone to a Neptune transit, especially if it's at a key point. I think I see your point. Yeah, it's interesting in that regard because that would definitely point to. I think Neptune was definitely involved in both those cases. It just seems so logical to me because of the presence of Neptune in people who live that kind of life is really that'd be a good book in itself. Believe it or not, would be. The presence of Neptune in celebrities' lives because of that. But what's interesting is when you enter this conversation into the world of twins, and we see people born at similar times with similar characteristics, and yet their exposure and their presence, because of the precision with which you do that, because you're setting the geometry to a whole new level by doing the ninth harmonic, you're getting much more precise. So even children, twins that are born minutes apart, might have different set of nakshatras, might have a different set of a planet of a ninth harmonic chart because you're getting much more precision, right? And so that precision allows us to get into. So if somebody's ascendant is different by two degrees or whatever, you're going to see that reflected in that more precise representation of the chart, and that therefore you might see lives that evolve much differently.
And also, I would like to add that. The prime factor in who we are is who we are, not the birth chart. So we in my understanding of life, there's a soul level to who we are, which we carry with us and who we are, and we bring this into every existence that we have. And no two individuals are exactly the same. So even though they're twins and they're born at the same time, they're very unique individuals, and they'll express the planetary energies in different ways. So that's why I don't really think it's accurate to simply do a birth chart for somebody without actually knowing them at all, or at least being with them and feeling their energy and being able to intuitively receive from within yourself what could be accurate for this person, and receiving their feedback and offering information to them which is useful to who they are as individuals.
Right. But by knowing them personally, you can also get flavor for personality, and you begin to see what's there. By not knowing them and just reading the birth chart as a pure basis, as a pure diagram that you're trying to parse somebody's personality, that also provides you with the ability to get in very precise ways to begin to explain something that you don't know. So in itself, it's sort of self-validating in that regard, because you're tying things in that you're saying, I don't know you, I don't know what your occupation is, but I can see you should be a teacher or whatever. Those things are very valid, and I find them to be accurate in that regard. The ninth harmonic is so the 27 into the 360, which gives you the 13.20, is the nakshatra. That is the same. That also ties in with the precession of the equinoxes, which is a much stronger, a much more complicated topic, which we can't get into now. But it does explain the variations in the Vedic process versus the Western process. In many ways, the Vedic process does seem more accurate because I think there's more data there. There's more. You're getting a closer, more magnified sense of what the person is like in that regard. We've been talking today with Michael Bergen. He's the author of the Astrology Code, Statistical Evidence of Universal Design. His website is astrologycode.org, O-R-G. And before we go, Michael, I thank you for coming on. It's been a great conversation. What is the one thing that's been most remarkable for you in your discoveries here, as far as, sort of like, when did you have that aha moment, so to speak, when you said, wow, I've stumbled onto something I think that's valid, or have you had that moment?
Well, I think that the entire project is my aha moment. I just feel a tremendous sense of fulfillment for having been able to do this work and hopefully add to our understanding of ourselves as human beings, and hopefully be a part of the the human momentum towards self-awareness.
Yeah. It's a really wonderful thing because it's very validating in some ways, and those of, and I'm one of these people. That's why I appreciate your work so much, and I can't wait to get the book. Is that it really has a sense of, I've always thought there's a divine logic in the world here that we all have, and we have sort of this code, and the code's the right word, of existence and code of operating instructions. I think that's just the right way to say it. This is sort of what you're destined to do, and to have that ability there, I think is remarkable, and I think that your work brings a lot of it gets us one step closer to that scientific proof that we're looking for, that we all seem to be looking for. And I think as time goes on, when we have more data is collected, we'll be able to make that case pretty strongly, I think. As this goes on, this is probably an evolutionary process that is going to continue as time goes on, just by virtue of the fact that more time and more data and more people are entering into the world, and we'll have more on which to draw.
Yeah, and as we learn that the universe is actually a manifestation of our true divine self, it encourages us to connect with that self through our hearts and our intuition. And as we connect with our inner self, we connect with the world around us.
It's our duty. It's our duty to understand it. I mean, it really is our duty. And what I also like about it, I think in some way, if we all became more apprised of our astrological charts and our astrological profiles, we would be far more tolerant of others, I think, because we'd say, they were born when they were born, we cannot change who they are, this is who they are, I am born when I am born, and never the twain shall meet. That may be true, but at least it provides a logic for perhaps not working, and then in that, somewhere, is a sense of tolerance. I think
sure.
At its core, there comes a sense of tolerance. So.
True. Not everybody is the same, nor do we need to be.
Nor do we need to be. Thank God we're not. Exactly right. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. Anyway, again, my guest today has been Michael Bergen. He's the author of the Astrology Code, Statistical Evidence of Universal Design. And it's a fascinating discovery. I think anybody who's a skeptic of astrology or wants a little bit more in the way of validation and sort of concrete background will do well by this book. It's available on his website, astrologycode.org. Michael Bergen is his name. Michael, thank you so much for talking. I'd like to have you back on again. We could get into this topic much deeper at some point in time. I can see that, but I do appreciate you coming on today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Very good. Yeah, it's great. Thanks. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.